Hello, and welcome to part 2 of this lecture on video games. What we're going to be doing in this part is looking at some ethical debates about video games. So, in particular, what we're really going to focus on is the question of, is it wrong to play ultra-violent video games? And it's worth noting that this is a pretty old debate. So in the 90s, Jack Thompson came out with a quote about how, look, video games are just murder simulators, and murder simulators are not constitutionally protected speech. He was really kind of worried about games like Doom, just to show how old the worry is here. But I think probably it's brought out by games like Manhunt, which is arguably pretty close to a murder simulator. Now, the traditional objection why people find ultra-violent video games ethically problematic is that, well, ultra-violent video games expose players to violence, and exposing people to violence tends to or leads to violence. If you play a game where you go around killing a bunch of people, well, it's going to increase the odds that you do some violence. Now note, this traditional objection isn't really specific to video games. It applies to them, it applies to cinema, it applies to literature and music. Pretty much any kind of communicative vehicle that can convey violence, either depicting or describing. So the traditional objection isn't really interesting. It isn't something per se about ultra-violent video games. So, but there is still a reply. And the traditional reply is that, look, simulating a morally objectionable act or describing or displaying a morally objectionable act is not itself morally objectionable. For example, Christian Bale, who was the actor who portrayed Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, isn't morally bad for pretending or make-believing to be Patrick Bateman. Right? And you're not morally bad for simply observing or reading something that involves some morally objectionable acts or actions. But here's where we hit something interesting. It looks like there's a key difference when we think about video games from cinema, literature, music, etc. And it's that games are essentially interactive. This is something we talked about before. And in fact, many of them are going to be self-involving. That is, instead of merely watching someone get shot or, behave morally objectionably, you're the one who's doing the shooting. You're the one who's doing the bad actions. So as McCormick kind of says, right, the player's actually pulling the joystick trigger, inflicting simulated harm, him or herself. And this seems like a big difference. It's one thing to just engage with or see or hear some description of a morally objectionable act. It looks like it's a different one to be the one who's maybe just in the game, but committing the bad action. So how do we then make sense of this? What can we say? Well, when we think about the kinds of problems here, and the kinds of maybe relations or actions that come through, it looks like we need to be a little bit more careful. Right? In particular, we can think of different relations that might allow us to do different kinds of morally reprehensible acts. So we might have kind of player-on-player actions that are morally objectionable. This includes things like ganking or griefing, where we have a kind of clear victim. It's maybe just instances of bullying. But of course, we might also just play it off as like, this is just part of the game. And exactly how to understand this might depend on particular circumstances, but it does seem to just boil down to bad actions towards another person. Contrast that with things like player versus non-player character violence. In particular, you might think of virtual murder. So this is the kind of thing that happens in games like Manhunt that got people like Jack Thompson so pissed off. You go around murdering people. Or another amazing one, right? No Russian from Call of Duty, where you can, if you want, gun down a slew of unarmed civilians in an airport. Right? So if you shoot the civilians in the airport, did you do something bad? Well, there's one sense in which no, because nobody really gets hurt, right? It's just a game. We'll come back to that reply in a second. So, but again, the first kind maybe is just bullying, maybe we can understand it. The second kind, maybe there's something funny. The third kind is the third relation to pay attention to is whether it's just a player on themselves. And here there seems maybe some interesting things going on about, or maybe there's a problem about allowing yourself to cheat or preventing yourself from kind of growing or improving. We'll come back to this tweet later on. Maybe there's also something more substantive. You're harming yourself by inculcating certain kinds of activities or certain forms of action. This is kind of broadly Kantian problem, maybe, or a broadly virtue ethicist objection. So, yeah, is it wrong to play ultraviolet video games? Well, maybe it kind of depends on which relation we're thinking about. But by running with this idea, we can actually draw out something really interesting. So this is a problem that's known as the gamer's dilemma. So to get a grip on the gamer's dilemma, let's start off by talking about virtual murder. Right? So virtual murder. Player commits virtual murder when they direct their player character to kill an NPC, a non-player character, such that were the game environment real, the action would constitute actual murder. So note it's not killing in general, but it's murder. And we don't off killing in general because maybe there's issues about self-defense or something like that. Let's just talk about the cases where it's just flat murder. You're driving along in Grand Theft Auto, you get out of the car and you just gun down somebody walking on the sidewalk. Right? Cool. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Now note, in this case, it seems fair to say no one's harmed when we commit virtual murder. It's just a game. In fact, I said it just a slide ago. So it seems morally permissible to commit this kind of virtual murder. People do it all the time. Thousands upon thousands, if not millions of players are doing it as I speak these words. So let's think about, let's set that aside, and let's move on to a different case. Let's think about virtual pedophilia. Right? Now, a player commits virtual pedophilia when they direct their player character to commit actions towards a non-player character such that, were the game environment real, the player character would be deemed a pedophile. And if you don't like this, you can use other cases. So, what's interesting is, by parallel argument, we should be able to say the same thing we said in virtual murder. Well, hey, no one's harmed when we commit virtual pedophilia. It's just a game, right? It's not like there are any real children harmed. They're just bits of the game. They're non-player characters, just like the people we gunned down when we did our virtual murder. So, it seems morally permissible to commit virtual pedophilia. That's kind of weird. And a lot of people are going to feel pretty uncomfortable there. So this brings us to the dilemma. Suppose you regularly commit acts of virtual murder. So you're a gamer in this relevant sense. So the gamer's dilemma, according to Morgan Look, is that, look, unless you can identify a morally relevant distinction between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia, then these two actions must either be morally permissible or they must both be morally impermissible. That is, the two seem to stand and fall together. And the problem is, either option seems to entail something intuitively repugnant. If we think that both are morally permissible, that seems to grate against the intuition that virtual pedophilia is okay. That seems wrong. Virtual pedophilia seems just fundamentally deep, dark wrong, in a way that's very different than virtual murder. But if they're both morally permissible, then it's okay after all. On the flip side, if they're both morally impermissible, well, then it really looks weird because I don't know. I mean, a lot of people seem to think that these kind of virtual murders are perfectly fine. It's just part of these games. It's something silly and dumb. You just driving around, driving people over in GTA or whatever, right? It doesn't seem like it's harmful at all. But, right, there's the flip to it. It looks like, well, maybe it's got to be just as bad. So this is the gamer's dilemma. Right? Either these virtual acts are all okay, in which case you've got to accept that they're all okay, or they're not, in which case, well, we got a lot of sins to make up for. And neither one of these seems very good. So the interesting debate here is to try and find a way through the dilemma that doesn't end up embracing either horn, because the two horns look like they're both repugnant. So that's a pretty cool and I think interesting argument, thinking about why maybe video games are ethically problematic. Some video games are going to be ethically problematic. Some game actions might be ethically problematic. But are there any kind of video game ethical arguments for them? That is, any kind of ethical arguments for playing games? And there's a couple cheap ones. I mean, the first one is that games are fun, and there's a clear value in entertainment and having a good time. Obviously, this is, dismissible. It can be trumped by other reasons, right? But at least prima facie, this is an argument in their favor. Another cheap and cherry one is that they seem to directly, not seem to, playing games, buying games, directly and indirectly helps fuel the economy, right? Remember the thing we started with. Right? If you think that this is a good thing, big if, then you got a good reason. Right? Again, defeatable, but it's a reason. Same thing, games lead to improved visual perception, spatial cognition. And these are all kind of true, but it's not really clear how useful or how powerful these arguments are. So you might wonder if we can develop a moral argument for video games, something kind of deeper than just these kind of weird pragmatic ones. And I think there's probably 2 points here. The first one is something like what we can call the catharsis hypothesis. So catharsis is a notion really developed by Aristotle, which is that we go and engage with things like tragedies in order to purge ourselves of a bunch of negative emotions. So the thought is video games, especially ultra-violent video games, are useful because by acting out our built-up emotions, we get rid of them, we release them, we purge ourselves of them. So video games might be good, morally good, because they allow us to vent our aggressive impulses, thereby actually reducing aggression. And notably, video games are going to be better than just simply watching other kinds of media forms of violence because it's letting us actually perform them. We get them out. We do them. However, it's not really clear if this hypothesis is actually empirically true. The evidence isn't decisive. Notably, evidence with regards to playing ultraviolent video games, some empirical evidence here suggests that people who already have a tendency to be violent, if they play ultraviolent video games, will actually behave more violently afterwards, rather than having this kind of purgation, which suggests that it might be false. Still, there's some more empirical tests to be done. There might be a different moral argument, and the moral argument here is one that Amanda Costin and I have worked a little bit on. The idea is that video games might allow us to have a kind of empathy machine. That is, what we might be able to do is take up, by playing a game, the role of an agent in a particular kind of circumstance. Basically, games support what we might call fictional agency, and in so doing allow or provide support for fictional agential experiences. For example, I can't know what it's like to grow up in war-torn Bosnia in the early 90s. I just didn't, and that's not something I know what it's like. What I might be able to do is, in certain restricted circumstances, engage with a kind of game, what's sometimes called a serious game, that will allow for me to have the relevant kind of fictional agential experiences that correspond with the real ones that people had. So I might be able to play a game that will allow or generate certain kinds of participatory or agential activities or experiences that once I'm in them, I can leverage to get a certain kind of standpoint. And having that standpoint, I can derive the relevant ethical knowledge that would otherwise maybe be inaccessible for me, or I wouldn't be able to understand in a certain kind of way without having the right kind of experience. Then, having kind of grasped that within the fictional scenario, I can extrapolate this knowledge or the understanding back into the real world. If this works, if this kind of empathy machine idea works, then we already have a prima facie moral argument for video games. Because a lot of these experiences that are going to be cut off, the standpoints involving, are either pragmatically impossible for us to experience or are morally questionable. We might think it's very important to know what it's like to be a combat experienced soldier, to see what it's like to be a soldier on the front lines, but we're not going to then go give people a bunch of guns and send them off. This might give us a morally acceptable way to undergo certain experiences. Now, of course, this is a very weak argument. It's only going to give us moral arguments for some video games, but it looks like it might support it. So, what did we do really in the last 15 minutes or so? We had a real quick survey of some questions about video game ethics. We looked at Morgan Luck's Gamer's Dilemma, a really interesting little puzzle there, and talked a little bit or thought a little bit about whether there's possible moral arguments in favor of video games. That's our first two bits here. What we're going to do in the next section is think about digital aesthetics again. In particular, what we're going to do is think about what does it mean to aesthetically appreciate video games? Is there something distinct about doing so? And that's what we're going to talk about. So take care, and I will see you shortly.